Welcome to our midweek discussion, although it won't be much of a discussion today because everybody had pressing business and weren't able to join me on the discussion this week. However, I did want to cover a few more things in Doctrine and Covenants sections 135 through 136. In particular, I want to talk about why Joseph was martyred, a little bit about the governor of Illinois, Governor Ford, some reasons for the expulsion from Nauvoo, the dissension that occurred in the church, and then crossing Iowa. Let's read verses 38 and 39 from section 136. Which foundation he, meaning Joseph, did lay, and was faithful, and I took him to myself. This is the Savior speaking. Many have marveled because of his death. But it was needful that he should seal his testimony with his blood, that he might be honored, and that the wicked might be condemned. Brigham Young goes on to write the following. It was also a strange thing to me that Joseph Smith should have to lay down his life, until I found the following passage of Scripture. It is contained in the 9th chapter of Hebrews, 16 and 17 verses. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. So when Joseph Smith fell by the old well curb at Carthage jail, pierced by the bullets of assassins, he placed the capstone upon his mission by sealing it with his blood, and from that time henceforth it is in force on all the world. Robert L. Millett wrote the following in an Ensign article in 1994 entitled Joseph Smith Among the Prophets. The life of Joseph Smith was in some degree patterned after that of the Master, Jesus Christ. That pattern holds true even when extended to its tragic conclusion. Like his master, Joseph also shed his blood in order that the final testament, the reestablishment of the new covenant, might be in full effect. This is a picture of Thomas Ford, who was the governor of Illinois from 1842 to 1846. He's also the author of the history of Illinois from its commencement as a state in 1818 to 1847. You can see here he died relatively early at the age of 50. He said some very, very interesting things when he wrote his history of Illinois. Governor Ford feared the name of the martyr Joseph ring as loud and stir the souls of men as much as the mighty name of Christ himself. Sharon, Palmyra, Manchester, Kirkland, Far West, Adiamon, Ramus, Nauvoo, and Carthage jail may become holy and venerable names and places of classic interest in another age. It's interesting that many people have in fact visited those sites. I know I had an opportunity some years ago when my oldest son was going on a mission. I took him to visit many of those places. Like Jerusalem, the Garden of Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Calvary to the Christians, and Mecca and Medina to the Turk. By Turk he meant Muslim in this case. And in that event, the author of this history feels degraded by the reflection that the humble governor of an obscure state, who would otherwise be forgotten in a few years, stands a fair chance, like Pilate and Herod, by their official connection with the true religion, of being dragged down to posterity with an immortal name. I think it's very interesting that he, in fact, prophesied of what would really happen. I know I heard a story this week from one of the podcasts that I listened to, where President Hinckley was visiting some historic sites, and he wanted to go off on his own. And as he did that, his wife was sitting in the car, and he was pacing back and forth, almost talking to himself, and his wife leaned out the window and said, "Gordon, let it go, Gordon." And so then he came back into the car and they proceeded. President Hinckley was very, very upset at Governor Ford. Here's an interesting painting that depicts the destruction of the printing press and type of the Nauvoo Expositor. Now, we talked about this a little bit on Sunday. The Expositor issued only one paper. And then the local council at Nauvoo, the city council, deemed it a threat to the peace of the society and had it destroyed. And this was really the beginning of the demise of Joseph Smith and his eventual martyrdom. It's interesting to note that John Taylor recounts what the governor said to him. While Governor Ford agreed that it was within the rights of the Nauvoo Council to have this nuisance destroyed, he in fact said, I, meaning the governor, would have got up a mob to destroy it, and that would have cleared the city council. It gives you an interesting insight into how the people, the politicians of the time, worked and how they got the job done. So let's talk about what happened in Nauvoo. Here are 5 reasons that are presented in a BYU quarterly study that talks about the martyrdom of Joseph. One of the reasons was Joseph's insistence on carrying out the Lord's commandment to go forward with plural marriage. This was really difficult for almost everybody who heard it. This was in a Victorian society where marriage between a man and a woman was considered sacred, and anything other than that was considered extremely unusual and strange. The fact that John C. Bennett had scandalized the nation with the idea of spiritual wifery inflamed this even further. But we often see this. Satan will often take a counterfeit of something that is true and good and warp everybody's opinion against it. Another reason for the problems in Nauvoo stem from apostate dissension. William Law, who had previously been a member of the First Presidency and had committed adultery and was excommunicated from the church, decided in his anger that he would do all that he could in order to drag down Joseph Smith. There were other apostates who did similar things. It would seem that if somebody is disaffected with the church, rather than just let it go and leave, Satan takes them and leads them to create this disruption, to stop the work of the Lord. There was a lot of religious suspicion in the area. Many leaders of other churches were threatened by the power, by the large following that Joseph Smith had. Additionally, there was a political struggle going on. You remember that when the saints originally arrived in Illinois, they were gratefully accepted, they were treated well, and they were courted by both political parties because they had a swing vote. If they could court the vote of the members of the church, that would put them in power. At that time in Illinois, the parties were split pretty much 50-50. Both parties tried very hard to get the members of the church to vote in their favor. That's really the reason why they were able to obtain the charter from Nauvoo, which gave them so much protection. That's also one of the reasons why that was the first thing that they went after to try to get rid of their power. And number 5, they were just plain wicked men in the area. This was frontier area where men fled to in order to avoid the law and to avoid responsibility. In fact, it was well known that for almost nothing you could get somebody murdered. Another person that we should mention is a newspaper man who originally, when the saints came to the area, Thomas Sharp, was very favorable towards the church, but as time went on, he switched sides and became very, very antagonistic. In fact, he had control of a newspaper in Warsaw. After the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor, he wrote this in his newspaper in Warsaw and was a key factor in stirring up all of the people in the area. War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens, arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Every man will make his own. Let it be made with powder and ball. As a counter to this, you can see what Joseph Smith wrote in his last letter to Emma and to the children. I am very much resigned to my lot, knowing I am justified and have done the best that could be done. Give my love to the children, and may God bless you all. Amen. He wrote this on the day he was assassinated in Carthage jail. Joseph Smith had an inkling. He knew that his time was numbered. And so in March of 1844, he made sure he gave the keys of the kingdom to the 12 apostles. And then he said to them, now round up your shoulders and stand under it like men, for the Lord is going to let me rest a while. So the death of Joseph Smith constituted this rest that the Lord had promised him. It was devastating to the saints. Those who were against the church felt that with the death of the prophet, that the church would just fail, that it would fade away. But it didn't. Now, in accumulating some of these things that I've been studying this week, I thought I'd give you some reference material. One of them is this book here on the right, Storming the Nation. It's written by Derek R. Sansbury, and I listened to several of his podcasts. He's probably the preeminent scholar who talks about Joseph Smith's political aspirations and why he decided to run for President of the United States, as well as the political missionaries he called. Apparently there were over 1,000 men who were called as missionaries to go out to all the states and to not only preach the gospel, but also to do some politicking for Joseph, for him to be considered a candidate for the President of the United States. You can see here on the left, this was his platform that he presented, and you will notice also that he didn't present himself as president or prophet, but as General Joseph Smith of Nauvoo. And then also Sidney Rigdon was presented as the vice president. Now Sidney had made a move to Pennsylvania because it was necessary for the vice president to come from a different area. The other areas that I went to this week for information was a book called The Assassination of Joseph Smith by Ryan Jenkins, and also online, the Saints publication that we've been talking about for a long time includes many, many valuable stories that are easily read. And lastly, there's an article that was produced into a book by Dallin H. Oakes many years ago. He wrote it in 1975. It was published in 1979, that talks about the trial of those who were accused to be assassins of Joseph Smith. In that, he indicates that what Joseph and the Council of Nauvoo did with the Nauvoo expositor was legally correct, that there was a precedent for it, but it probably wasn't the best thing to do at that time. Okay, moving along, I want to talk a little bit about the people who dissented away from the church. Now, there were several reasons why people did this. After the death of Joseph Smith, it came as such a blow to everybody. They were very, very concerned. The members of the church were very concerned about why was Joseph Smith allowed to die? He was a prophet of the Lord. What happened? The next question that they all had in their mind is, who's in charge now? What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Is the Lord still with us? And there were a number of people who presented different ideas and thoughts. This gentleman in the top left-hand corner of this group of photographs is James Strang. And he purported to have a letter written by Joseph Smith that indicated that on the death of Joseph, that James Strang would become the leader of the church. And he led a very sizable group of people into the Michigan-Wisconsin area to an island called Beaver Island. And there he crowned himself king. And he had about 2,000 followers. His little kingdom there continued until about 1856, whereupon he was shot and killed. And then most of the people who had dissented away from the church and gone with King Strang then returned to Nauvoo and joined the Community of Christ, or the RLDS Church. Another individual who led away a group of people was this gentleman here, Lyman White, who was an apostle who was then excommunicated from the church. He said that going to the mountains was crazy, that instead they should go to Texas. Texas was an independent republic at that time. They had split away from Mexico and established their own republic. And so Lyman left with a group of saints and went to Texas and established a church there. Texas was eventually included into the United States. Lyman died in 1858. Apparently he had some sort of an epileptic spasm and died. And again, most of the people who left with him, after he died, the church dissolved and they returned to Nauvoo. The third group is the group that followed with Sidney. And you remember the story of Sidney. After the death of Joseph Smith, Sidney said he wanted to be a guardian of the church, and because of his position in the first presidency, that he should be the guardian, and that he would wait until somebody from Joseph's descendant line grew up and was old enough to become the prophet. But that didn't work out. A decent amount of people left with him, and he returned to the Pennsylvania area, where he died in 1876, and then the church basically dissolved, the church that he started at that time. And then, of course, there was Brigham Young. The vast majority of the saints followed Brigham Young, and they left and went to the mountains. But it was a very difficult time. I'm showing you this map because I want you to understand some of the distances that were involved. Here we have the Nauvoo area. This is Omaha, which becomes winter quarters. And this is Kansas City, which is very close to Jackson County. The saints were forced out of Nauvoo for those 5 reasons that we talked about earlier. There were at least 12,000 members of the church who made the move from Nauvoo across this area here, which is Iowa, into Iowa-Nebraska area and settled in winter quarters. This was a very, very difficult journey. They left in February 1846, which was much earlier than they were going to leave. They were going to wait until spring. But Governor Ford lied to them and told them that there was an army coming that was going to stop them from leaving. So Brigham began sending parties out right away. I want you to notice Kansas City down here, which is Jackson County, Missouri. It's very strange to think, but it was the closest civilized area, and many of the saints traveled back and forth to Jackson County to get supplies. In fact, this area, Missouri, was instrumental in making sure that the saints stayed alive. They were able to winter through 1846 and 1847 in winter quarters. I want to talk a little bit about this journey that happened from Nauvoo to winter quarters. And you can see this distance doesn't seem very far when you compare it to, for example, winter quarters to Salt Lake. It took them longer to go from Nauvoo to the Omaha area than it took for the average group to go from winter quarters to Utah because of the rainy season. I couldn't find any pictures of that era, but I was able to dig up some pictures, and these are World War I pictures. But I wanted you to envision what it would be like to have a cart and horses and trudging through mud. It rained continuously for several months and turned that whole area into like a swampland. Many of the saints talk about having to push their wagons up to the axles in mud. It would have been very, very difficult. Brigham used consecrated funds, tithing money from the church, to purchase and build 1,800 wagons so that they could make that exodus. Remember, there's 12,000 saints who have to make that journey in the winter and spring of 1846. When they were kicked out of Nauvoo, there were approximately 1,000 deaths in that next year. And that was mostly because of exhaustion, pushing those carts through the mud every day, exposure, and several diseases. The most significant was scurvy because they lacked fruits and vegetables. There are numerous accounts of people who survived that journey but who had their teeth fall out because of scurvy. Winter quarters has approximately 1,000 unmarked graves on both sides of the Missouri River, and a total of as many as 1,500 deaths by the mid-1850s when other people began to make that journey. So that means that approximately 1 in 10 or 1 in 12 people died in that year. When they arrived at winter quarters, they had to establish a city. One of the podcasts that I listened to said that Rome wasn't built in a day, but winter quarters almost was. It's really a miracle that they survived that first winter, because in that area, weather is routinely in the minus 25 degrees. And they built 500 log cabins, which really isn't enough to handle that many people. So many people lived in dugouts, in caves, in wagons, and in tents. To give you an idea, here's the story of Stillman Pond, which I don't think is very well known. In 1833, his wife died from the yellow fever epidemic. In 1845, his son Charles, who was an infant, died. He was among the last to leave Nauvoo, and he left at gunpoint. The reason he stayed was to help, to make sure that the saints all got out. In 1846, he lost Lowell, Joseph, and Hiram, his 3 sons. And then later in that year, He lost 3 daughters, Laura, Harriet, and Abigail, all within 5 days. And then early in 1847, he lost his wife, Maria. So you can see that this was a brutal time when many, many people died. So the next time you sing, Come, Come Ye Saints, which of course was written by William Clayton, you'll get a sense for what verse 4 means. And should we die before our journey's through? 1 in 10 people died in that journey of 300 miles. William wrote this when he got news that his son was born from his wife who had remained at Nauvoo because she was expecting a child. It says in his journal, "This morning I composed a new song. All is well. I feel to thank my Heavenly Father for my boy and pray that he will spare and preserve his life and that of his mother, and so order it so that we may soon meet again." I also discovered that Come, Come Ye Saints is not only a popular hymn among members of the church, but it's also loved by many other religions. There are modified versions of it that appear in several Christian denominations' hymnals even today, including the Seventh-day Adventist. I wanted to also mention the Mormon battalion that occurred at this time. Remember, Governor Ford leaked information that the United States was sending an army, and he lied to them that said it was going to come to stop them from leaving the United States. In fact, there was a small contingent of the army that came out, but it came to ask for volunteers from the members of the church to raise a battalion of 500 people to help in their war against Mexico. This would have been extremely difficult for the saints, who up until this time had received no protection from the United States and had been pushed from New York to Ohio to Missouri to Illinois and now out into the middle of nowhere. They were destitute, they needed all of their manpower, but they also needed the money. So Brigham Young encouraged 500 of the best men, the most able-bodied men, to join the Mormon battalion. And all of this money was then given to their families, and the families consecrated it to the church to help everybody have enough money to move the saints. It also allowed them to have permission from the federal government to establish winter quarters, which was on Indian land. Without that, they would have been in trouble because they wouldn't have had permission to build their temporary quarters. When Joseph Smith was in jail in Liberty, Brigham Young was left in charge, and he established a covenant, which many historians now call the Missouri Covenant, in 1839 that said, "We all will go out of Missouri together or not at all." This was reestablished in Nauvoo when they did the Nauvoo Covenant that basically said we're going to do the same. We're going to all leave Nauvoo, and we have to take our poor and those who are not able to travel on their own with us. And then in winter quarters in 1847, he reestablished the covenant again. Now, Brigham Young had a very, very difficult personality, apparently, but he was very esteemed by the people because he defended the widows, the orphans, the children, the sick, the poor, and the dying. And he was always concerned that those who were in a better situation made sure that they all worked together, and his philosophy was, we all go together or not at all. Now, I want you to remember this slide that I presented on Sunday. And notice that section 135 was given here right after the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram in mid-1844. But then there's no canonized revelation until the beginning of 1847. That's 2.5 years when section 136 comes. And that's the revelation that talks about how they need to travel in companies. This was an important revelation. It was like this bright light. It was like the sun that comes out after a storm. This is how the saints felt about section 136. The storm clouds were parting, that the Lord was talking to them, that they finally understood why Joseph Smith had to die and why he had to seal his testimony with his life, and that the Lord still loved them and still was revealing what they had to do through a prophet who was Brigham Young. So I hope that this helps you with your continued study of section 135 and 136. I'd like to bear my testimony that I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, and that he truly did some amazing things under the tutelage of the Lord. He was visited by angels. He was visited by prophets. He restored the Church of Jesus Christ back upon the earth. And for that, I am so grateful. Have a great rest of your week.